Hello there. I'm your host, Max Comer, and welcome to this week's episode of our weekly science show, The Adventures into the Unknown World of Science. In this week's episode, we will be going into the fascinating act of DNA replication. Now, what is DNA? Well, if we look inside a cell, and then in its nucleus, we can see these strands of DNA. This cell is using DNA almost as if it were an instruction manual. But we're not assembling a couch. It's instructing the cell to create proteins that tell it how to function for the betterment of the organism. These instructions are made of hundreds of small little nitrogen bases that are connected as a string through phosphate and sugars. Opposing this string of DNA is an alternate string of DNA that is composed of the opposite nitrogen bases forming bonds with their opposite cells. There are 4 nitrogen bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Out of these 4, there are 2 pairs that always connect with each other when forming their DNA ladder: adenine and thymine, and guanine and cytosine. No matter what the order, the opposite will follow oppositely. Remember, when it's A, it will be T, but if it's G, there will be C, and when T comes back and C strikes back, you will have AG. Depending on the direction the phosphate is facing, up or down, it will determine 2 orientation numbers on the top and bottom of the strand. The number 5 represents the beginning, and the number 3 represents where it is going. Now, I'm sure we will get much more into DNA and how it works in a future episode, but for today we will be simply going into how it replicates. If you remember last week's episode of the Adventures into the Unknown World of Science, you will know that cells divide through a process called mitosis. Now, if you have a good memory, you know that within the first step of mitosis, interphase, DNA replicates. This is done so that each cell that originates from mitosis has the same instructions as the original cell that divided in the first place. So let me explain to you DNA replication. At first, the process of unwinding the DNA strands begins. This is where the enzyme helicase goes through and separates the hydrogen bonds that hold the 2 nitrogen bases together and unwinds the DNA. These singular strands of DNA are held back by single-strand binding proteins that are continually placed on the brink of what we in the world of science like to call the replication fork. As the DNA separates into 2 strands, a new enzyme called primase begins to place complementary nucleotides every so often. This also allows for the next enzyme to help in DNA replication, DNA polymerase. DNA polymerase goes to the newly placed complementary nucleotides and begins to synthesize the missing nucleotides that complement to the old ones. When DNA polymerase goes through and adds on the new complementary nucleotides, it always starts at 3 and works its way to 5. This is fine and all for at least the top strand in this diagram, but for the bottom one, there is trouble. The DNA polymerase is always moving away from the replication fork on the bottom strand, since 3 is on the right and 5 is on the left. This means that in order to keep up, the DNA polymerase has to skip some of these nucleotides on the bottom so it isn't left behind. This bottom strand is now referred to as the lagging strand, while the top one is referred to as the leading strand, since it does not need to slow down. The problem this causes is that DNA does not work unless there are 2 equal halves to instruct the cell with. But for every problem, there is a solution. And so the cell ingeniously uses the enzyme ligose to connect the Ozaki fragments together that were left by the DNA polymerase. Once all the strands have been gone through, DNA replication is done, and we are left with 2 separate ladders to instruct the future of all who watch, allowing you to be you, and for me to be me. Thank you all for watching this week's episode of the Adventures into the Unknown World of Science. Next week, we will be going into why you should probably stop overworking yourself.